Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining the Association of Pacific Rim Universities APRU Multi-Hazards Virtual Summer School. It is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this webinar series. This is organized by the APRU Multi-Hazards Program and the International Research Institute of Disaster Science, IRIDES, Tohoku University in Japan. I'm Takako Izumi, Associate Professor of Tohoku University and Program Director of the APRU Multi-Hazards Program. Also, I am a moderator for today's session. The APRU Multi-Hazards Program organizes the summer school every year since 2013. So this is the 8th summer school since the first summer school held in 2013. Unfortunately, the summer school this year is virtual because of this COVID-19 disease. But I hope I can welcome you in person at the Tohoku University in Sendai next year. The regular summer school includes the one-day field trip as well to visit the affected site by the Great East Japan Earthquake and Tsunami, in addition to 3-day lectures and group works. So this webinar series comprises 3 separate sessions. The first one organized today, then the topic and theme is the lessons learned from the Great East Japan Earthquake and Tsunami. The second one, which will be held on the 22nd next week, is the topic is role of various stakeholders in disaster risk reduction. And the third one will be held on the 29th, and the topic will be the latest research in disaster science. For the third one, we invited the speakers from the different countries. And those who have not registered the second and third webinars yet, so I'm really grateful if you could do so after this session. And I'd like to introduce the APRU very briefly. The APRU is a network that consists of 55 universities in the Pacific Rim from 18 economies, and its international secretariat is in Hong Kong. And it brings researchers and academic leaders and policymakers together to collaborate on effective solutions to various challenges. And it focuses on leveraging the collective education and research capacities into the international public policy in programs including natural hazards, women in leadership, population aging, and global health, and others. And you can receive more information on the APRU and APRU events and programs on its website. And this multi-hazard program was established in 2013, and its secretariat is hosted by Tohoku University in Japan. The program has been working to strengthen the collaborative researches on disaster science among the APRU member universities and contribute to international and regional discussions for RDR policy making through various channels and platforms. The activities include this summer school and the annual research symposium hosted by member universities and the campus safety program and others. The campus safety program organizes a workshop also every 2 years, inviting experts from different sectors to discuss the disaster preparedness on campus. So today we will have 3 lectures from the faculty at International Research Institute of Disaster Science, IRIDES, in Tohoku University, to share the experiences and lessons learned from the Great East Japan Earthquake and Tsunami occurred in 2011. And Tohoku University is located in Sendai in Miyagi Prefecture that was seriously affected by the disaster. And it has been almost 10 years since then. And while you're listening to the presentation, I'd like to encourage you to send us questions using the Q&A function. And after each presentation, I will take questions from audience and ask the speakers to answer the questions. And also, we would like to ask you to share the webinar information and tag at APRU 1997 and hashtag APRU Plus on Facebook and Twitter. So now I'd like to introduce and welcome the first speaker, Professor Ueki, Toshio Ueki, Vice President of Tohoku University. So Professor Ueki, and floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Okay, it is great pleasure for me to welcome all of you to the APRU-IRIDeS Multi-Hazard Virtual Summer School. Unfortunately, due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, I am unable to meet you directly and welcome you in person. We strongly hope that all facing great difficulties will be overcome in near future. Natural disasters have been a serious concern for many years, especially in Asia and the Pacific Rim. We have already observed an increase in the number and the scale of natural disasters, especially due to climate change, urbanization, population density, and environmental degradation. Very recently, several areas in Japan were severely affected by heavy rains and flood. Every year, we witness such devastating affected by flood everywhere in this country. This is undeniable fact emphasizes the importance of early warning systems, the understanding by citizens of hazard maps, and immediate taking of decisions to evacuate to protect lives and assets. To tackle these global challenges, 3 important international agreements were adopted in 2015, namely Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, firstly, secondly, Paris Agreement for Climate Change, and thirdly, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. This Sendai Framework was adopted at the 3rd UN World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction held in Sendai in 2015. The support and contributions of universities and academia are essential for the implementation of the Sendai Framework, which is based upon several interdisciplinary studies and the application of science and technology. We are expected to support action taken by local communities and authorities, as well as to be the interface between policy and science for decision making. On March 11 next year, it will be 10 years since the Great East Japan earthquake and tsunami. To contribute to the recovery efforts and provide technical support for the process of recovery, Tohoku University established the International Research Institute of Disaster Science, IRIDeS, in 2012. Through this, we have always aimed to share our global gained knowledge and experience from several interdisciplinary studies and to contribute to build a society resilient to natural disaster. IRIDeS also launched this multi-hazard program together with the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, namely APRU, in April 2013. Since then, IRIDeS has become the hub and coordinator of this program activities. This summer school is one of the major events within this multi-hazards program. The regular summer school includes a field trip to the site affected by tsunami in 2011, where one can learn about the recovery process and lessons acquired from the local people. Though we cannot take you to this place, unfortunately, because of the current pandemic, but hopefully next year we will be able to organize this summer school here in Sendai, which you can participate. The experience of COVID-19 is reminding us that the disasters to which we are vulnerable are not only natural, but also biological, chemical, and industrial. Actually, the Sendai framework also emphasizes, quote, it applies to the risk caused by natural or man-made hazards, as well as related environmental, technological, and biological hazards and risks. It aims to guide the multi-hazard management of disaster risk in development at all levels, as well as within and across all sectors. Quote, we need to make further efforts to tackle and reduce the risks posed by these different types of disasters. The responsibilities and tasks assigned to us are now much more difficult and complicated, and further collaboration among different sectors is necessary. I'm very much looking forward to engaging in collaborative research and activities with you in future. To conclude, I would like to thank the APRU Secretariat and Dr. Tremian for their kind support in organizing this virtual summer school. I wish all of you very success in this virtual summer school program. Thank you very much indeed for your kind attention. Thank you.
Currently, thank you very much for your remarks, welcome remarks, Vice President Ueki. And as you mentioned, indeed, Japan is currently suffering from very serious floods. And definitely COVID-19 is harming the effective disaster response towards these areas. So that as a multi-hazards program, we also continue discussion about how we can tackle these multiple hazards like COVID-19 and floods. And again, thank you so much for your support from the Tohoku University to the Multi-Hazards Program. Thank you very much. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Christopher Tremewan, Secretary General of APRU. Thank you very much, Chris, for your joining us today. You have just came back from New Zealand, and thank you for your time.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Right. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be here. And Vice President Ueki, Professor Izumi, eminent speakers, colleagues, students, and other participants joining us from all around the Pacific Ring of Fire. It's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of APRU for this first virtual multi-hazards summer school. This summer school is a core activity of the APRU Multi-Hazards Program and is hosted, as you know, by Tohoku University, and we're very proud of this productive partnership. As Vice President Ueki has noted, we've done this since 2013, had the summer school. It's usually taken place physically at the International Research Institute of Disaster Science at Tohoku University in Sendai, aiming to engage faculty and students in sharing knowledge, experience, and lessons learned from the 2011 Great East Japan earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear disaster. As many of you will know, for many years, the deadliest and most costly natural disasters have taken place predominantly in the Asia-Pacific region. And the Association of Pacific Rim Universities, member universities, have world-class research capabilities related to these challenges. And of course, this year, These challenges are compounded by the COVID-19 global pandemic that is affecting all of us in ways we could not even imagine 6 months ago. The next slide is, right, APRU, Tohoku University and its other member universities, like most organizations globally, have had to adapt to this different mode of working, while our societies are struggling to cope with the widespread and multifaceted impact of the disease. And as an association of leading research universities of the Asia Pacific, it's more important than ever. It's our social responsibility to work with other sectors, governments, industry, NGOs, and local communities on effective solutions to these challenges, which are now compounded, as I said, by the disease. APRU consists of these 55 universities across 19 economies of the Asia Pacific. It is a super connector in the sense that it enables universities to establish meaningful relationships to foster innovation and exchange knowledge and to address these critical issues for our societies. The COVID-19 situation is a reminder that in these uncertain times, APRU, with our extensive reach, is able to connect a diverse community of people to lead, create, inspire, and learn together. And as a service to all our members, we have set up APRU Plus, you can see on the slide there, an online hub of information for all of us working virtually. This hub gives members access to resources that help universities to foster information sharing. And we also have developed and host webinars focused on higher education themes, as well as key APRU program areas such as multi-hazards, which of course is the subject of this seminar. Only a few weeks ago, the APRU Multi-Hazards Program hosted a policy discussion on flattening the curve and early recovery lessons with speakers from the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and experts from Korea, the Philippines, and Japan. Please visit APRU Plus for more information and and to register for these exciting opportunities. To conclude, I wish to thank again APRU-IRIDeS and Tohoku University for their strong partnership. My special thanks goes to Professor Imamura, Professor Morao, and Professor Izumi and their team, as well as to Vice President Ueki, for their dedication and unwavering support in developing this program and the summer school. I wish this virtual summer school every success. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Chris, for your kind remarks, and as likewise, your support and the Secretariat support is indispensable for the multi-hazard program, and I really appreciate your strong support to the multi-hazard program. Thank you so much. Okay, so next, I'd like to introduce Professor Shinichi Egawa as a first speaker today. And he's from Division of International Cooperation for Disaster Medicine, APRU-IRIDeS, Tohoku University. So today he will talk about medical and public health resilience. He has contributed to domestic and international disaster medicine through his research and other activities. He has more than 200 English publications. So please, Dr. Egawa, floor is yours. Thank you so much for your participation today.
Okay, can you see my slides? I hope so. Hello, everyone. Something is reaching to me, but okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone, or somewhere in the world. Good evening or good late night. And I'm Shinichi Egawa, professor of IRIDeS and a medical doctor and a surgeon. And I'm going to talk about medical and public health resilience. And okay, the Professor Wiki mentioned about the Sendai framework, and I want to understand my concept, that way of thinking. How do we understand the risk? And I'm a medical doctor, and I have a similar. I found some similarity between disease and disaster. Like a disease and disaster consists of three factors: tsunami, earthquake, and okay, I'm sorry. Let's look at this picture. Tsunami and earthquake are called natural hazard. And radiation, or the Ebola virus is also, Ebola is a kind of a biological hazard, and radiation is a radiative or nuclear hazard. It's called technical hazard. But the hazards needs community to become a disaster. Because when a strong typhoon is on the Pacific Ocean, nobody is harmed. But when it attacks the community, which has some kind of vulnerability and capacity, the outcome consequence is a disaster. So the general concept of the disaster risk reduction is know your risk and reduce your risk and prepare to act. So to reduce the disaster risk, the risk is calculated as a multiplication of hazard or hazard exposure multiplied by the vulnerability and divided by the capacities. So that to reduce the risk, make the upper part smaller and make the lower part larger, and the risk becomes much smaller. So the Sendai framework is also based on this concept. Sendai framework has 4 priorities. Priority number 1, understand disaster risk. Number 2, disaster risk governance, manage your risk. And priority 3, invest in disaster risk reduction. Spend some money for the disaster risk reduction. And priority 4, this is a long sentence, not long sentence. Enhance preparedness of effective response and build back better in recovery, rehabilitation, and reconstruction. Because I'm a medical doctor, I'm responsible in the response part. But to effectively respond to an outcome of disaster, we have to be prepared. So the Sendai framework has 4 implementation, like inputs, to make the infrastructure better, or national local strategies better, or international cooperation better, and multi-hazard early warning system better, we can reduce the outcomes. The number A, mortality, B, affected people, C, and direct economic loss. So the Sendai framework has more words, numbers of health. Because Sendai framework is the first framework to describe that disaster affects health of the people. Do you believe this? Previous frameworks, Yokohama strategy, Hyogo framework for action, did not mention anything about health. Hyogo has 3 words of health. How did they use? Make the health facilities strong in disaster. That was so important. Because of that Hyogo framework, many hospitals were strengthened for the disaster. But Sendai framework mentioned disaster affects the health of the people. So Sendai framework aims to reduce the disaster losses with significant economic, social, health, culture, and environmental impact. Why? Because health is very important, And we have to understand the health risk is always changing in each disaster. In 1923, Tokyo metropolitan area was attacked the September 1st at the noontime, magnitude 7.9. Such earthquake attacked the Tokyo area. Many people died because of the fire, not only the shake or collapse of the building. The buildings were made of woods, so that fire occurred because of the noontime, so many people were killed by the fire. So the buildings should be fire resistant. This is some lessons learned in Japan. And every September 1st is the disaster drill day. In 1995, Great Hanshin Awaji earthquake occurred, attacked the Kobe area in Hyogo Prefecture. So this is a reason why Hyogo framework for action was taken. And at that time, also fire occurred, but many people were killed by the collapse of the buildings. Asphyxia means by the death by the collapse of the buildings. So the Japanese government enforced a law that buildings should be quake-proof. And also Japanese Association for Disaster Medicine was established soon after that. In 2011, Great East Japan earthquake. I don't replay this video, but you can see that tsunami is approaching to the ground of some place. This video was taken from the fourth story of the building, but when it comes to that, the real situation, everything was like that. People were died of drowning at that time. In Hanshin Awaji earthquake in 1995, 6 people were killed by the collapse of the building, but 40,000 people were injured by the collapse of the buildings. In 2011, 20,000 people were killed by the tsunami. However, the number of injured people were much, much less than that number where Hanshin Awaji earthquake. It is because of the disaster risk reduction of the making the buildings and houses stronger to the disaster shake of earthquake. However, another medical needs were identified. Less injuries, different medical needs which lasted longer. Disruption of traffic and communication made health sector paralyzed, so the hospitals cannot function well. Complicated radiological disaster by the Fukushima nuclear power plant accident. Mental health of affected people was devastated. Health facilities were also destroyed by disaster and could not function. And education of disaster medicine was not generalized in health professionals. I am a professor of disaster medicine, but I have never taken a class when I was a medical student about the disaster medicine. So the disaster-related deaths were officially recognized, certified by the Japanese government for the compensation. In Fukushima Prefecture, where a nuclear power plant accident occurred, the disaster-related deaths continued to occur more than 2 years. So this is 2018 Japan floods, and the number of houses were affected by the flood, landslides, so that more than 100 people were killed in Hiroshima Prefecture by the landslides. So that the type of hazards will vary, depend on the type of hazard. Damage will vary depending on the type of hazard and geographical locations. So that how we can make a capacity against such situations. The Japanese disaster medical system is having this type of system. There are more than 700 disaster-based hospitals. They are usually serving to the community as a tertiary referral center. They have the ICU and ER for the daily operation, but when a disaster happens, they establish supporting headquarters, they also dispatch DMAT, and they have an emergency infrastructure, also the seismic proof building structure, emergency water supply, oxygen supply, and power supply. Also, they have a heliport to dispatch a team. And the disaster, so this is a geographical location throughout Japan. In Tokyo metropolitan area, there are more than hundreds of them. This is a picture of typical DMAT team. They are training in the airport in collaboration with the self-defense force, and they have also trained for the confined space medicine. But now the role of DMAT is changing to support the disaster-based hospital and other local hospitals. And this is managed by the information sharing system called Emergency Medical Information System, EMIS. And there is one national headquarters under the Ministry of Health. So this information sharing system is updated to show that this is an actual situation in the Kumamoto earthquake, which occurred in 2015 or 16, I think. And this is indicating where the DMAT team is, where the disaster-based hospital is, where the local headquarters is, so that everybody can see remotely or locally where the response and what is going on at the response. So that this is a summary of the building back better of National Disaster Medical System in Japan. So disaster medical coordinators is coordinating locally and nationally using the system already I've mentioned. And so that DMAT is supporting the headquarters of disaster-based hospitals, and also support the headquarters in the staging care unit and the distant disaster-based hospitals. Because of the experience in the Hanshin Awaji earthquake, it is almost impossible to save all the patients in a resource-scarce area within the disaster-affected area. So the best way is to transport the prioritized patients to a distant area using the airplanes and emergency ambulance cars. So lastly, but not least, I'm going to mention about how we can make the healthy and resilient society. Please look at the website using the search keyword Inform Risk Index. Inform Risk Index is used in the European Union or United Nations as to indicate the national risk index of each member states. So it consists of the 3 dimensions: hazard and exposure, vulnerability, and lack of coping capacity. Meaning, if you have a coping capacity, this lack of coping capacity is getting smaller. So the total risk will be smaller if you have a disaster risk reduction. And these red rectangles indicates something related about health. There is a very interesting negative correlation between the life expectancy of that country and the total informed risk of that country. Japan has a long life expectancy and low disaster risk. Why? Japan has a high risk in the hazard and exposure. As you know, Japan is a very frequent earthquake and also tropical storms, including floods. However, Japan has low vulnerability and low lack of coping capacity. This is a reason why Japan has the total low disaster informed risk. And very interesting correlation is natural hazard risk and life expectancy. I'm indicating the Japan as a red circle. And when the risk of earthquake, very strangely, the life expectancy correlates with the earthquake risk. Also, tsunami risk, tropical cyclone risk. I don't know why. Please think about by yourself. However, if you have a frequent drought, you have low life expectancy. Japan has very low risk of drought, and Japan has very low risk of flood. But as Professor Ueki mentioned, now the flood is going on everywhere in Japan. So that 10 years, 20 years later, the life expectancy might change. And health-related categories also correlates with the life expectancies. If you think about these risks, the socioeconomic vulnerability risks, the poverty index, Gini index, gender inequality, aid dependency, the life expectancy is short. If you have higher children under 5 mortality, the life expectancy is short. Also, the lack of access to healthcare, the life expectancy is short. So the global countries are classified to the clusters according to these parameters, so that all the world can be like cluster number 4. So that we might contribute to improve these situations. So in conclusion, disaster affects the health of the people. The injury or loss of life, the evaluation of the quality of life is becoming much more important when you think about the disaster risk reduction, because people's needs, the top 3 priorities by the UN survey is a good education, better healthcare, and honest and responsive government. Now we are facing the paradigm shift of the hazards, not only the natural hazard, but the biological hazards like COVID-19 is affecting our society. So how we can be resilient? Let's think about that. That is my presentation, and I thank you very much for that, your kind attention. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Professor Egawa. And now we have a couple of questions for you from the audience.
Sure.
So I will just ask the questions first, all the questions first. And the first one is that it's very, very fundamental question related to COVID-19. How can we reduce biological hazards such as COVID-19? That's the first question. And second one is that about risk perception. So is there any major has been taken by Japanese government to state what kind of risk perception is appropriate, such as prioritizing health first? So that's the second question. And third one is that, do you have any established assessment tool that employs specific indicators to assess the the status of mental and public health resilience or vulnerability and the risks for flooding or for different hazards? So that's the 3 questions from the audience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Probably it will take a day or 2 to answer all of these questions, but for the first question, the COVID-19 or biological hazard, the human being has been facing to many threats from the biological pathogens like virus, bacteria, or many others. And for example, Japan was suffering for a long time because of the tuberculosis. We controlled the tuberculosis for the to avoid the exposure to the bacteria that will cause the tuberculosis, and also the capacity building was the economic growth of Japan, and also the nutritional and medical countermeasures to the tuberculosis, so that we control the tuberculosis in a very early phase after the World War II. And also the COVID-19 is a virus. The virus requires a human being to propagate, or animals to propagate, so that we have to live together with the virus. And only one virus that human being was successful to eradicate was smallpox virus. We eradicated the smallpox virus so that there is no smallpox virus anymore in the world, only in the test tube in a very, very limited lab. But mostly the virus is not so much well under control. So that confinement, as every newspaper or every government is broadcasting, the confinement or wearing masks or washing your hands is a very basic but very important strategy to reduce the exposure to the virus. That is our strategy. So the second question, what was that?
About the risk perception.
Okay, risk perception.
Create the risk perception on health issues, for example.
Okay. And also the risk perception is a problem of individual risk perception. So when you see a beautiful picture, someone may think, oh, this is beautiful, or someone may not think this is not so much good. So that risk perception differs from person to person. So it is important to identify what is the scientific truth and what is important to know. And for example, the COVID-19, most of the patients are not so much get sick, but some people, like older people, some people with chronic diseases has a higher risk of getting severe condition. So this is the important idea. Understand your risk and manage your risk. That is a very same concept with the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. And for the mental health, the indicators that may relate it to the third question, and please understand that health is not only the state of without disease. Health is meaning the well-being in physical and mental and socio-economic condition. So that health needs physical health, mental health, and social health, socio-economic relations of the surroundings. So that being healthy needs some social interaction. So the indicators I showed in the informed risk index is very much related with social factors or social determinants of the health. So understand the concept of the social determinants health. So if you are poor, you don't have money enough to go to the hospital, you will suppress your desire to get to see the doctors. So that being poor is a social determinant of health. So understand that relation between the health and the risk concept perception or indicators, such indicators as a informed risk is utilizing is very helpful for your understanding of the indicators. Is that all okay?
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Egawa. So related to that, the last question and the indicators and the assessment, is there any existing, how do you call that, the tool about the assessing the health risk published somewhere, the organizations?
Okay, you can go to the WHO's website, also the Inform website, because they are using the publicly available data from all United Nations member states. And those indexes are publicly available and also can be downloaded from the WHO website and also Inform website. And for example, gender inequality. Gender inequality index can be downloaded, is publicly available, and gender inequality may be related with some mental health of the men and women. And so that mental health is also has a very much close relation with the social capital or social surroundings. So that how do you react with the surrounding is a function of the mental health. So there is no simple answer. But when you think, this is because of, this is very interesting and important question that you raise. And so please study further to get the answer. That is my answer.
Okay, thank you so much. So this will be the probably the last question. And
Okay.
again, this is related to COVID-19 pandemic. Is there any technology or applications which can help COVID-19 pandemic resilience or mitigation in Japan?
You know, the technical application means many things. For example, we have a smartphone application that detect the contact time with person to person without identifying the individual. It is called COCOA, and it is recommended by the Japanese government to identify the close contact time with a person to person. If this person is infected with COVID-19, automatically the notice from the government or server will reach to a person who might have a close contact with the infected person. So this application identifies the possibility of possible infection from that infected person to this person without identifying him or her or him or her. So that, but the limitation of this application is how many people are using this application. You don't have to be afraid of releasing your personal information, but everybody has to have this application to get the result more reliable. Okay, this is one example. There are many.
Yeah, I'm sure there are so many innovations in technology
Yes.
here in Japan and all over. Okay, thank you so much for Professor Egawa for your presentation and answering the questions. We received more questions, but unfortunately, due to the limited time, and
Yeah, send me later. Okay.
we have to close this session. But once again, thank you so much for your wonderful talk, and also the audience. And thank you so much for sending your questions a lot. And I'm very, very sorry we cannot answer all of them. But once again, thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay, so that I would like to introduce the next speaker. The next speaker will be Professor Sebastian Bolle at IRIDeS, Tohoku University. And today he will talk about people and disaster approaches from cultural and social sciences. He's an anthropologist and associate professor at IRIDeS and Tohoku University in Japan. And his research areas include disaster and death, grief, public health, disaster and the environment in Japan, Indonesia, and France. He holds a PhD in anthropology from Oxford Brookes University and master's degree from the University of Oxford. So he usually researches the disaster from the more, the human and or social science side. So it could be very different from the first presentation from Dr. Egawa. So Professor Bore, that's your floor is yours. Thank you so much for your joining us today.
Thank you very much, Takako, for your kind introduction. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar, and thank you for the organizers for adapting so promptly to these new conditions that we have. Related to today's talk, actually COVID-19, as you can see, is pushing us to develop new cultures of sharing knowledge, of teaching, of communicating. Even though the technology was there, I think these new conditions kind of shows us how we able to adapt and use technology more efficiently to be together and today in hundreds and sharing knowledge and talking. So I think that's just illustrate the point I'm going to talk about today, which is mitigating people and disasters and approach from social sciences. As Takako introduced, I'm a social anthropologist, so I'm mainly working with qualitative data. So I don't work with numbers. I work mainly with how people think, how people speak, and how people experience disasters. I work in Japan, Indonesia, and France, essentially, but I've been traveling in other areas and in the world. For this talk, I would like to look at 4 points essentially. The first is the disastrous process. I think this is just to set up the base for our discussions. This normally is, this class is addressed to students, so not everyone is used to working in disaster science, but I think it's important. Then the second point will be looking at risks. Some overlaps, obviously, with Professor Egawa's talk, but hopefully some new information as well, or maybe new angle. And then we'll be looking at social vulnerability, which Professor Egawa touched upon. And then finally, resilience as well. So I'm kind of like giving you like 4 concepts that hopefully can help us to better understand disasters, and that concept that are already used in disaster science. And that's why even as medical doctor anthropologists, we share the same terms, because that's what we do. So disaster as process. Well, first of all, is like thinking about disasters are natural hazards disasters. No, they are physical agents. As you can see on your slide, there are waves, tsunami waves, there are hurricanes, they might be fires, they might be a symbol of earthquakes, but they're not all disasters. Disasters, like if you look on the left side, top left side, you have the tsunami wave by itself on one side, and then the tsunami and the house on the other. So which includes people. And that means that basically a disaster is a human-centered concept, okay? And that's why it's very important to understand people, culture, and society in order to understand disaster, because this is our creation. The idea of a disaster is not something which is natural. So a disaster is a human settlement in which we add a physical agent, like you see on the slide, a volcano, which still active, and then suddenly we have an eruption. The lava falls upon the village that is settling at the back, and we have a disaster. So I often use this analogy with my students because I think it speaks to all of us, even those who have more experience in disasters, is that think about a car accident. A friend of yours drives often very fast, doesn't wear his seatbelt, or she doesn't wear her seatbelt, and doesn't have an eye check. One day, she or he calls you and tells you, "Oh, I had an accident. What a terrible thing." Already in your mind, you're going to think, well, you're already speeding, you don't have your eyes checked, and you don't wear your seatbelt. So the event itself, even though it's an accident and maybe not planned on that day, was bound to happen, or was likely. The risk, as Professor Egawa mentioned, was very high. So in the same way, so the origin of this accident actually is a process, is a thing that we do every day, and when it's met with the event, then we have what's something called the accident. And then after that, this is not the end of the story. Your capacity to repair your car, the capacity to pay for insurance, the capacity to go for medical care is also part of this disaster. So we start, we have this whole follow-up from the origin to the event to the impact. And why is this important? We're going to see in this next slide, is that therefore, if you think that way, then you have to think, when you think about disasters, you have to think about human-people relationship. You have to think the way you develop your cities, the way you develop your villages, the way you prepare or you don't prepare for a disaster. What kind of social inequalities do you have? The same way, once the event's gone, you have to think about reconstruction, spiritual care, of course, healthcare, which go together, financial aid, technological support, international or national solidarity, and political leadership. And at the bottom of those, you have concepts that which can be at the beginning or at the end actually of this process, which are vulnerability, risk, resilience, and adaptation. Okay, and this is not just related to the disaster, but that's a part of the structure, part of the everyday life that we share as a society or as a culture. So let's look at exposure to risk. So in order to understand risk, and I always have to emphasize that with my students, because sometimes we assume the environment in which we live, but a natural phenomena bring a set of opportunities and risk. So for example, on your right side, you have people living next to a volcano. And the reason why they migrated there is because it gave them opportunity, which is to have a fertile soil for agriculture. Comes with the opportunity comes the risk, and this is the eruption. And often people are very well aware of that. So just to summarize the idea of risk is that Cannon said that the risk, and this is the quote here, the risk inherent in nature consists of a wide range of hazards that put constraint on production, and that I haven't mentioned yet, which is like, for example, frost affecting agriculture, frost or very low temperature, sudden low temperature that might be part of the environment, and on other aspects of livelihood and safety. So that includes earthquake, flood, drought, and here volcanic eruption. Okay, so opportunity and risk come together. But the sources of risk are not limited to natural hazard, but also depend on human behavior, right? So here you have another scenario where you go by the coastline for fishing, that's your opportunity. You have a risk, which is flood. But the risk of flood itself is not enough. It also depends on the evacuation behavior, for example. And that will increase or lower your risk. And when you say risk, here we speak about human lives. Furthermore, risk is not something we have to understand as a natural phenomena, but also as something we make, you know, and that we're very well aware, and especially in this in the current situation of COVID-19, the way we create energy, the way we might induce pollution, the way we might contribute to global warming or climate change, whichever term you prefer. These are actually a human consequence on the environment. And so we create our own risk. And in this concept, we actually talk about a lot of Anthropocene era now, you know, how much humans are having an impact on their environment. So just to summarize this idea of this first section on risk is that risk is not an objective fact. And Professor Gawa mentioned it, you know, very clearly. Risk depends on perception. And I think this perception is not just due to individuals and is actually very complex. It's based also on people's adaptation. We dictate people's adaptation and disaster mitigation. That is why we need to understand how people manage risk and opportunities. And this risk perception and adaptation depends on political, economic, and social forces. And we should never neglect those because they are very powerful. That's what makes our societies and our culture running in the first place. And they oblige people to adapt to an institutional environment as well as a natural one. And there is no better time to think about this than at the time of COVID-19, where you saw so many different ways of dealing with COVID-19. Of course, because the environment might have been different, political conditions are different, our political leadership might be extremely different, and there might be other economic and social forces that push politicians and ourselves to act differently, but also, and culture, of course. And, but just to summarize the point is that, so we have to look at, you know, what Oliver Smith said, that we can frequently be the cause of our own hazardous situation. So now I'd like to move on to the third concept, which is vulnerability. And I use again the car metaphor. It's not that I'm a big fan of cars actually, but I prefer motorbikes. But the fact is that it's a good analogy. If often I ask my student, which car do you prefer to be in? Which car would you prefer to drive? Well, I'm going to answer for this on this occasion, but I used to always like this little blue smart car, or both of them are for Mercedes, rather than the big Class C. This is because I like fun, small and easy to park cars. But 3 years ago, I became a father. And when I became a father, suddenly this beautiful, cute blue car became actually very dangerous for my daughter. I started to think, what if I have an accident with my daughter in it? So therefore I changed cars. Unfortunately, I couldn't buy the Class C, but I bought a bigger car. So if that is true for an accident, why not during a natural hazard? Meaning, so the idea, and I still hear this, sometimes this being claimed, that the idea that we are all equal in a disaster, including a tsunami or anything, is a myth. You know, vulnerability is the degree to which people are exposed to risk. And this varies from person to person. And it's based, it depends on your ethnicity, your class, your gender, your disability, your age, poverty, education, and so forth. And I'll just put this as a note, there are different types of vulnerability, but we don't have time to go into this right now. So how do you identify vulnerability? Well, there's something called forensic research, and which means that to look back at what happened during a disaster, and sometimes it's very good to look at very far. And in the case of COVID-19, a lot of people have been looking at what happened during the Spain flu, for example. And in my case here, I'll be looking at the Titanic because it's an example that speaks clearly. So you have this boat, it's in the middle of the ocean, crash into an iceberg, and it starts sinking. But when you look at who are the survivors and who are the victims of the Titanic, you will find very different case of death, of percentage of death. Here, actually, I should mention, this is a percentage of passenger being saved. It is written here. So this is not the number of deaths, but you can see straight away when it comes to children, the social class has a big issue. Social class is a British concept, but I believe you understand it. And the people, the children for first class and second class, which happened also to be higher in the boat because the boat was divided into 3 layers, first class, second class, third class, were very likely to survive. Actually, we had almost 100% survival among first and second class children, but not in third class. And that was a choice. This is not natural. It's not because they're better swimmers than the third class children. It's because there were not enough lifeboats and they privileged the first and second class children. When it comes to gender in the same boat, the percentage of saved life was also very different depending on whether you were a man, a woman, or a child. As you can see, women were much more likely to survive, and that's because, again, it was decided that women were the most vulnerable, and in the British culture, women should be saved first together with children and men last. So that's very good to know, but how do we create vulnerability and therefore how can we stop it? Well, we have to look at some of the things I might have mentioned already, but first of all, development. How do we develop our cities? How do we develop our communities? Secondly, what kind of inequalities do we have? Not just about disaster, but in general, because this will influence the way they experience disasters. And reducing vulnerability, and that's very important, that thing that we share with Professor Egawa is that it's not just about number of lives and number of deaths. And that's unfortunately, even during COVID, it has been often the case that people only look at number of deaths from COVID-19 or number of infected people. But actually, we have to think about the psychological, the social at the bottom here, the social and the cultural impact of disasters. And these are huge. And making our society less vulnerable to on this level as well is also extremely important as for the survivors that we are. And finally, I'm going to conclude. I have about, I think, around maybe 6 minutes before the end of, so I'm going to conclude with the disaster resilience. resilience already introduced by Professor Egawa, so I won't spend too much time. It's a concept that comes from civil engineering, and it was adopted systematically in 1867. And this is the idea that the beam, you put pressure on the beam and then it returns to its initial state. So it's not its strength, right? It's its ability to return to its initial state, so to bounce back in, if you like. So the strength of human society, and that's a social analogy, the strength of human society under stress, its ability to devise means. So it's not to resist, it's to devise means of resisting disasters and maintaining its integrity, so not to collapse as a social item. So while lies its ability to adapt to circumstances produced by the calamity. As I said, COVID-19. Here we have suddenly a web seminar culture that booms and we all get used to it, and that's, in a sense, that's a new culture. It's not, it's not something that every nation was used to, and certainly not at the global level was used to do. So adaptation, and that's what we have to look at. We have to look at how societies adapt, and that's why you cannot talk about resilience without talking about people, and so therefore you have to look at society and culture and see how they adapt through times. I'm going to use the case of Japan because it was the theme of the seminar. And especially I'm going to look at Tohoku and the Sanriku coast, where there's an history of tsunamis. Here you see the same area hit by 3 different tsunamis, one in 869, one in 1896, and the other one was 2011. And what kind of adaptation have we seen in these areas? One thing is actually, to pass on this knowledge. At a time when there was no smartphones, no web, no digital archives, maybe, and so forth, people used actually tsunami stones to actually tell the future generations, and we're talking not just 1 or 2, but maybe 10 generations down the line, please don't build houses below that stone because there's a risk of being inundated. Another one is behavior, and which there's a saying of tradition that says that, and it's called Terenko, some of you might have heard, and it's the idea that you have to save yourself by going higher ground if you experience a strong earthquake. And these things, they last not for just a few years, they last for generations. So you can see the power of culture and adaptation in this case. Now, I would like to look at environment and reconstruction because, yes, I look at culture and society, but building society and building towns is part of our culture because we do it very differently depending on culture and societies. There's something which is for me, very Japanese, is this idea of that we can elevate the land of the whole society, of the whole community, of the whole city. Here, the example is in Rikuzen Takata, but it was done all over the coastline of Japan. And basically on this slide, you see soil being taken and cut down from a mountain. And then it's transported here in this particular city on a conveying belt. And finally, it's piled up here on the plain where the city has been rebuilt. And for me, I can't go into details, but that's a very, very Japanese engineering kind of idea. Because remember, when it's not just the technology here, is that everybody has to approve and people have to think that this is a good idea. So the society at large kind of agrees and think this is something plausible. Adapting sea defense, again, that's a very Japanese experience. On the left side, you had this great seawall, which was called the Great China Wall at the time in Miyako City, and this seawall was said to be, resistance to any kind of inundation, any kind of tsunami, and to the point that people were building houses just here. The city would have come from here, and they built houses right up to the seawall. And when I say people, as a society, remember, we're always talking as a society, not as individuals. And unfortunately, on the right side, you can see the result of the 2011 tsunami, which went way beyond the expectations of the engineers at the time. And so in the face of this, including our institute has been thinking about very different ways of, or improving the way we think about seawalls and so forth. The most common one actually is not on this slide, but it's different layers. So you have you have a concrete seawalls, then it's followed by a kind of another type of seawalls or protections, and then you might have a forest, like here it is in the green seawalls of Iwanuma. So the and then another adaptation, sorry, here is the window, because a lot of people complained that seawalls were too opaque, so they didn't allow people from seeing the sea, and therefore that created an anxiety. So, and that I will come back to that, but you see, when you're actually sometimes creating resilience, you might create other forms of vulnerability. And in the case of a seawall, there is a common knowledge in Japan that building a seawall is great, but then it deprives maybe the fishing communities from access to the sea. And even though it doesn't stop necessarily, and it makes things more complicated for their livelihood and sometimes even stop their livelihood. So therefore, there is create a economic vulnerability and so forth. In terms of creating vulnerability also, it's said that this particular seawall there and others have created a false sense of safety. And I have heard that in a forthcoming paper that, you know, creating these big seawalls makes people feel safe, and therefore maybe reduce their aptitude to behave in the correct way in the case of a disaster, and here in the tsunami. So that's the point, that, and that's why things are so complex, and that's why we can never easily, first of all, find a solution, because you might increase, for example, in the case of heat wave, right, or heat, a problem that we face all over the planet at the moment. We have this kind of heat island effect in our communities, in our cities. A lot of the solutions might be, well, to create buildings which are, you know, better proof to sunlight and to heat, and then have air conditioning and so forth. The problem is that this technology also increase our emission of greenhouse gas. And so therefore, it also contributes to climate change, and you can see the cycle in which we are presently in. And not only that, but it creates, therefore, this climate change creates the vulnerability of those who may be not able to create such cities and such solutions. So that's the problem we are facing now, and one of the key maybe things that I would like to think is like, we do need to think about this very fine balance between vulnerability and resilience, and how creating the resilience doesn't increase vulnerability in some cases, and for other people within the same society or across the globe. That's it for now. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much, Sebastian, for your wonderful presentation. We received so many questions to you. And firstly, I'd like to take 2 questions for you. And this is regarding the disaster, the education, and what kind of education would be appropriate and also that you recommend to increase the community resilience. That's the first one. And second one is that you also mentioned about the human behaviors increase the disaster risks. So what kind of how can we make the people realize that their behavior increase the disaster risks? So these 2 questions for you.
Okay, thank you very much. And thank you, Takako. Well, in terms of, so the first question about education, there are things that we are doing here. So at APRU-IRIDeS, Tohoku University. So I'd like to speak about that first. First of all, I think it's very important to teach these things early on, as soon as primary school and junior high school and so forth. And we have a unit which is dedicated here at IRIDeS to collaborate with primary school and so forth to actually talk regularly to children, because, and the reason is, you cannot just produce a disaster education. It's a changing problem. Disaster is a changing problem, as we know too well right now with COVID-19. So you need permanently some people to research it and to be able to teach new knowledge, new information to children in order for them to prepare as best as we can to future crises and even unknown crises. Then comes also the general public. And I think this is, we have to take opportunities like COVID-19 again. I'm sorry, it's the same word coming again and again, but it's very important to actually teach the general public and to make sure that we don't return to a situation which made COVID-19 a crisis in the first place. So if you think about, teaching people about hygiene and teaching people about wearing masks and so forth. And because people forget very easily, and I work on social memory, and I will finish with that for this particular question. But social memory, the way we preserve it is a very conscious process. It's not natural. There's nothing natural about our social memories of disasters. It's choices we make as a society to say we are going to remember this, and to make sure that we learn from this and we keep on not making the same mistake, or at least reducing the impact of disasters using that particular knowledge. And here, of course, I think just to give another example, which is nothing to do with pandemics or natural hazards, is, for example, the war. All over the world, you have museums about war, and which are teaching a young generation, if you go to war, this is the consequence. This is where we're going. This is the nightmare in which we enter once we start a war. And that's why it facilitates, I hope, our politicians to not engage in war, and because they know, the general public knows that we should not do that in order not to enter that. And the same thing applies to the natural disasters. So now we have a COVID-19, we know that if we don't do the right thing, we enter into a nightmare scenario. And the same goes with climate change, the same goes with all kinds of disasters. So I think that's the way maybe to go. Then about the human behavior, how to teach people. Well, again, I mean, that's contained in the same thing. It's about education. And when I say education, I really don't mean a top-down kind of education, which is often results in conflict. It's like, if you talk to people like if they were children, we had this example in France, and the people just oppose any ideas then you suggest, even though there might be good ones. So you have to talk to people in a way which is which makes sense, and in a way that that encourage them to behave in the right way. So rather than telling them that the behavior is wrong, like for example, not washing your hand, not wearing a mask or something like this, you have to tell them about the benefits, and you have to tell them, I think, and that's where I think, in a sense, I think that's where the biggest conflict is at the moment regarding COVID-19 and in the world, is that we all share responsibility. And if we accept that I share responsibility for my colleagues, for my children, for my family, for my country, and for the world, then I protect myself. And that's something that we've learned in disasters, is that, in order to protect others, you have to protect yourself first. And so doing the right thing is not about yourself, it's about others. And I think that's something which we can try to teach people.
Sorry, we have more and more questions to you, Sebastian. So now you also mentioned about COVID-19 and also the relation to the society. And the next question is that, and after usually the disaster, what community-based activities can help reduce future risks as a method of teaching perhaps this become a possibility to gain resilience and adaptation to a new environment?
Thank you very much for the question again. That's what I try to do, at least myself, is, there's one thing that we do every year, which is a ceremony here in Japan for 2011. And something like a ceremony or holding a memorial, it's not just about about remembering the disaster, but it's about teaching about the disaster and able to, to share the knowledge and to make sure this knowledge is shared. So when you go to a memorial monument, when I go to a memorial monument, I always ask my question, what did I learn about that disaster? And if the monument is well done, then I've learned something, not just about that disaster, but also to protect myself from similar disasters. And so as a society, I think that whether you organize a ceremony to remember the disaster, whether you have a facility to remember the disaster, I would always suggest to include education and if possible, testimonies of people who have experienced it, and that's something that I think I've learned myself by experiencing disasters, is that you always think disasters is something that other people experience. And the fact is, it's something that we can all experience, and we all experience at some point. We just experience different disasters. And so having testimonies during these commemorations, and having the people who actually survived, whether they are still alive, which is wonderful, or whether they are maybe recorded a video, or maybe their testimony comes from many other forms. It can be an art form or anything. I think that's very important.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much, Sebastian. So that now we are facing to quite a big challenge in the program as in COVID-19. So how we can reduce the future risk of COVID-19 from this social science perspective? How we can pass on the share our experiences now for the future generation?
Well, I think, thank you very much again. I think one way to look at it first of all is to think about social habits. And I think that if I think about, for example, I'm French, so I'm going to take the French example. We never wore masks before. We don't have the mask culture. And so for people to actually wear something on their face, including me, is a really challenging thing. And that's one thing. So we have to remember that our bodies are the first things that catch COVID-19 and the first thing that actually transmit COVID-19. So the way we use our bodies is a really deep thing. I don't use my body the same way as a Japanese person does, and the Japanese person doesn't do as the same way as an Indonesian person does. So, and this you cannot change easily because these are ingrained for maybe hundreds, thousands of years. But there are things that you can do, which you can adapt more easily. Like, for example, the mask. Well, you might not be able to ask a French person to wear it 24 hours a day. And, even though there's a influenza, for example, like people often do in Japan, there's an influenza crisis or they often wear the mask but you can actually, at least at certain times, you can make it a habit for people to wear the mask. So, and comes with it, of course, wearing the mask comes with it habits of not touching the mask and how to wear the mask and holding the mask and so forth. So I think these are some of the things which are ingrained in our culture. They're ingrained in our bodies. How do we think about our bodies? We kiss in France. I mean, if I kiss Professor Igawa tomorrow, people are going to think I'm crazy. But if I kiss my professor in France, it's just a greeting. So but also that contributes to COVID-19, doesn't it? So our proximity and the way we use our body, we have to rethink all of that. And this really depends on each culture. And it's not a simple thing to do. And I'm sure even in Japan, I mean, we could bring back Professor Igawa in this context, but there might be some adaptation that are being done in Japan too. And even though there was already some social distancing, which was already there before the crisis. Yes.
Thank you so much, Sebastian. Indeed, probably the preparedness measures towards the COVID-19 will be different from country to country in the future. And it's quite a big challenges for us to see how we can help, these different countries and cultures to mitigate the future risk from the different disasters. Okay, so thank you so much, Sebastian, for your participation and wonderful presentations. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Taka.
Okay, so the next speaker, I'd like to introduce the next speaker, Professor Osamu Murao from IRIDeS, Tohoku University. And he will talk about urban disaster risk reduction, Japan as a disaster-prone country, and learning from past disasters. His current research focuses on post-disaster recovery process and urban design, and the relationship between physical environment, such as architecture and urban design, and disaster. He conducted a number of researches on the post-disaster recovery process for damaged areas in Taiwan, Turkey, Sri Lanka, Thailand, Indonesia, Peru, Philippines, and World Trade Center in New York, as well as the 2011 Great East Japan Earthquake and Tsunami. So Professor Murao, thank you so much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Hello, can you hear me? Thank you very much, Takako, and for joining this webinar. Today, I'd like to talk about let me share. Yes, today I'll talk about urban disaster risk reduction, Japan as a disaster-prone country, and learning from past disasters. Then I'll talk about three parts. How do you evaluate urban disaster risk, disaster life cycle, and Japan as a disaster-prone country, and learning from the past disasters? At first, how do you evaluate urban disaster risk? This is one mechanism of disaster occurrence. We can recognize the city as a system. For example, system is input by hazard, and as a result, the situation we can know the damaged or what level of damage or not. The hazard include earthquake, tsunami, heavy rain, typhoon, outbreak of fire as threat from the nature. And system is like characteristics of each city, including social, physical, and temporal situation. And the output, the damage is the physical or social situation. This is one of the ideas of urban disaster risk. We can recognize urban disaster risk as a product of hazard, vulnerability, and exposed value. And this is hazard. The picture is of typhoon. The hazard is a natural phenomenon or earthquake activity, a dangerous phenomenon, substance, human activity, or condition that may cause loss of life, injury, or other health impact, blah, blah, blah. The hazard itself is not so bad phenomena, but if under the hazard we live, it causes the disasters. This is a picture of vulnerability. There is one white bear in a vulnerable situation. Vulnerability is the characteristics and the circumstances of a community, system, or asset that make it susceptible to the damaging effect of a hazard. Then final thing is the exposure or exposed value. It means people, property, systems, or other elements present in hazard zones that are thereby subject to potential losses. Then let me talk about COVID-19. We are Japanese familiar with these 3 C's. We need to avoid closed space or crowded places or close contact settings. This is a countermeasure of exposure. Most of the people cannot fight against COVID-19. To escape is the best way nowadays. This is exposure. Anyway, we can define urban disaster risk like this, but we cannot control the hazard, and the exposed value is related to the urban, what can I say? What we need to do is reduce vulnerability. This is relationship between hazard, vulnerability, and risk. Then to reduce vulnerability means to reduce urban risk. Then our focusing target is vulnerability. The second part is disaster life cycle. We can use, this is one of the ideas to think about urban disaster management. Most people knows. Then this basically there are 4 basic phases after disaster: response phase, recovery or reconstruction, and to reduce future disaster, we need 2 strategies: mitigation and preparedness. Then what is mitigation and preparedness? This is image of, I'd like to show some images to explain these phases. There is one person near the falling rock. The falling rock shows hazard situation, and he is in vulnerable situation. This is the relationship between hazard and vulnerability. Then what we can do is basically the mitigation strategy. There are 2 types of mitigation strategies, basically. The first one is structural mitigation. With strong shelter, they can prevent the rock's impact. This is structural mitigation, which is related to construction levees after the tsunami damage or the earthquake resistance. The another mitigation strategy is land use mitigation. Sometimes the government regulate the location of the residents. This is land use mitigation. Of course, it is better if we have both mitigations, structural and land use. But to do this, we need money or regulation. Then sometimes it is difficult to conduct these strategies. Then what we can do is preparedness. Then compared with the mitigation strategies, we can do with unexpected money. Then, but to do this, we need to watch always the hazard situation. And he may need exercise to escape if the rock is falling. This is preparedness. But disaster happens in some situation. After disaster occurrence, there are another things to do. This is response. If she called 119 in Japan, she may rescue his life. This is the importance of response. Then response is activities occurring during or immediately following a disaster designed to provide emergency assistance to the victims of the event, reduce likelihood of secondary damage, and to expedite recovery operations. Then we enter to the recovery phase. Recovery is activities traditionally associated with providing federal supplemental disaster recovery assistance under disaster declaration. Recovery includes individual and public assistance programs that provide temporary housing assistance, grants, and loans to eligible individuals and government entities to recover from the effects of a disaster. Then, as you know, after the World Conference, the third World Conference on Disaster Risk Reduction, they adopted the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. Then one of the famous concept is build back better. This is the very important concept related to recovery. Then let me introduce Japanese situation. Then at first, hazard. Our Japanese country is located on the boundaries of the plate, Eurasian plate, Philippine plate, North American plate, and so on. Then this is the reason why we have had lots of earthquakes in the history. Then from the viewpoint of hazard, we have risk. Another thing is vulnerability. Our Japanese traditional houses have been constructed by wood or paper, which is burnable or vulnerable. Then this is the reason of high risk in Japan. Also, we have lots of wooden house congested districts in big cities in Japan. This shows the urban vulnerability because after the earthquake, it is difficult to respond to the about saving people or distinguishment of the fire. Then about the exposure, this is view from the Tokyo Sky Tree. We have lots of buildings in congested district. Then, as a result, we have lots of disasters. Then, this is one great fire in 1657 called Meireki Great Fire. Then after the fire, the government developed the open space to prevent future great fire disaster. The people could escape to the open space after the fire. And such open space became very popular public space. Nowadays, we call the areas Asakusa or Ryogoku. About the architectural vocabulary, after the fire, lots of fire, the walls were developed like this. You can see the walls between the houses. These walls were prevented to prevent future fire spread. We call it udatsu in Japanese. This is another idea after we could learn from the past disasters. Also, we found that the tidal roof was useful to prevent fire spreading. Then in some areas, the people used to use this tiled roof for the wooden houses. We had very important earthquake in 1923 in Tokyo. We call it Great Tokyo Earthquake. Then the earthquake killed about 100,000 people, mostly because of Great Fire. This is a picture of the Great Fire. Then after the disaster, the Tokyo government, the metropolitan government devised the plan. But to do this, the master plan, which was made before the disaster, became useful. It shows the post-disaster planning is very important. Then based on this master plan, the government recovered. Then sometimes earthquake or other disasters could improve the urban situation. Then one of the strategies of the post-earthquake recovery plan was this urban structure readjustment. Then Black Street was constructed after the earthquake, and the white or gray street network was previous one. Many people tried to change the urban structure since in 19th century, but it was difficult to do this because of some political reasons or and so on. But after the disaster, they could do this. Then finally, these wide street became the very important street for the 20th centuries in Tokyo. Then also, they constructed the recovery parks for evacuation place together with school, field, and parks. Then the 3 big urban parks were constructed after this earthquake. This is the Yokohama Yamashita Park. Here, the debris was used for construction of this park. This became very popular place in Yokohama, south of Tokyo. Then the government constructed this Dojunkai public apartment for the victims. This apartment was functioned for the urban culture in Tokyo in 20th centuries. This is fire. The Yamagata prefecture had Sakata fire in 1967. Then the Japanese could learn from the Great Fire, and based on the risk investigation after the fire, they found that 45 meters with street is useful to prevent the fire spreading. Then this green street network was constructed in Japanese cities. And also, this is a network of open space, which functioned, which became useful or a very important place after the fire or earthquake. Then we had learned a lot based on the disasters. This is previous disasters in Japan. Then this is the trend of number of deaths and missing persons. Then it shows the number of deaths was decreased because of these reasons. This is not included. The 2011 Great East Japan earthquake in 2011. Then 9 years has passed since the earthquake. Then we could see many recovery situations in Tohoku region. Then time is limited. One of my research is to evaluate the post-earthquake disaster recovery. Then I made these recovery curves after the Great East Japan earthquake, and we could compare with other earthquake recovery. Then I cannot explain now, but if you are interested in this, please look at the paper. Then one of Japanese concerns is the next big one in Nankai Trough earthquake. Then we have lots of things to do. Thank you very much.
we don't have enough time to ask you all the questions and yeah. So thank you so much once again for your very informative and valuable presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so this is all for today's session. And I would like to express once again sincere appreciation to all the speakers today and also the audience too. And thank you so much for your participation and also by asking a lot of questions. And again, I'm very, very sorry and I have to apologize for not being able to take all the questions. But thank you so much for your asking the questions. So this webinar was organized by the APRU Multi-Hazards Program and IRIDeS Tohoku University. As I mentioned at the beginning, this summer school comprises 3 sessions, so 3 separate sessions. So we have 2 more on the 22nd and the 29th. If you have not registered yourself with the next session, please do so after this session. The topic of the next week's session is role of various stakeholders in disaster risk reduction. So we have invited speakers from one of the international NGOs. It's called CWS, Church World Service, and also JICA, which probably you already know, Japan International Cooperation Agency, to share their disaster risk reduction experience and also the projects. And also, I will also speak about implementation of Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. So please be informed that the recording and the slides shared today will be on the website and also sending out by email. And you can check the website APRU+org to get access to these slides and presentations today. So I hope to see you at the next summer school session on the 22nd next week on Wednesday. So once again, thank you so much for your participation and see you next week. Thank you.